Looking and continuing our series on memorial stones, we're learning lessons from our history, and we have been examining the history of the Prescott Church, our fellowship. We're learning practical lessons of why we do what we do, but we also are celebrating the reminders again and again that this is a work of God and the way that things came about. And we'll look today also at how God has preserved his work. So today I'm just going to skip the verse today from Joshua 4 through 7 is our main verse. I'm going to get right into the lesson, and we're going to talk about Africa. And today's lesson is going to be the fellowship in Africa, part 1. There are so many great stories of how God led us into Africa and the work that God has done. I cannot fit it all in one. That's a nice problem to have. So a little later on, I'm going to take the early nations that we impacted in Africa, and then we'll look at other ones later on. The fellowship in Africa, part 1. We began looking at other nations. We had the first deliberate plant internationally was Perth, West Australia, and then I told about the miracle of Mexico, Holland, and then God helped us in Spain, the Philippines. So these were some of our early international churches. And so we began looking for open doors in Africa. Our call is to go into all the world. And so we are naturally looking for where can we preach the gospel. Africa, we were looking for open doors. Starting in 1985, some of our pastors started traveling to Africa. Primarily this would be Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Initially, we didn't have any churches there, so it followed a very similar pattern as the Philippines. That is, we would meet people who would invite us, and we would go and preach for existing pastors and existing churches, but not in our fellowship. They were outside of our fellowship. So, same pattern as the Philippines. We would hold healing crusades. And in Africa, these were very responsive, very, very good in terms of crowds, salvation, miracle, great open door through crusades. And often at the same time, we would invite local pastors to come. We would call it a conference. And it would be something like we do without the church planting because we didn't know them. But we were trying to, with local pastors, impart the vision. When you have something good, you want everybody to have it, right? So we're trying to impart the vision of prayer, evangelism, discipleship, some basic issues. And so we did this in a number of different nations, in a number of different places. And this was over the course of 18 months, 2 years. But the same issues that we faced when we started doing that in the Philippines, the same struggles. You have cultural and language barriers. So these are primarily Americans who are preaching to Africans. They are saying things that are clear to an American, but of course, through translation and different reasons, the message wasn't getting clearly through like they were saying it. And that can be for many different reasons. But the main thing, we came to the same problems and same realizations that we did in the Philippines. If you're going to work with people from other churches and other fellowships, the problem is you can teach and preach all you want. You're not going to overcome past reference points. They'll smile, nod, say amen, but they're interpreting everything you say based on the church they were raised in, the teaching, the doctrine, the people they know. So we came to the same conclusions that we did in the Philippines. My tongue got tangled there. And that is, at the end of the day, if we're going to reach Africa, someone has to go. The lesson, it's the same lesson we learned in the Philippines. Discipleship requires contact. So you can talk about discipleship, being a disciple. It's not going to work unless there is some level of personal contact. Mark 3:14.
Then he appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach.
This is an important part of discipleship. You cannot do this from afar. Sending books, videos, even occasionally preaching will not do it. There has to be a personal reference point in some way. They need to see a living example. Very importantly, they need to be able to ask questions. They need to be able to see your reactions. How do you react to situations in life? They need to be able to observe your lifestyle. All that is bound up in that statement, that they might be with him. That is what discipleship requires. You do not have to be best friends, take vacations with the pastor, but there has to be some level of personal contact. So here's a lesson that we're going to learn, and it's very powerful. One of the things I'm telling you in different places is, how do churches get planted? And here's the lesson: God prepares people to do his will. There's a couple named Brian and Mary Yeager. They were saved. They originally were discipled and sent out of Gallup, New Mexico, our church there. Brian did originally, he said he didn't want to be a missionary. That was not on the agenda. Then he began to feel stirred maybe to be a missionary. He didn't have direction where, and he said, okay, maybe I will be a missionary, but definitely not Africa. I will not go to Africa. And if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans, but that's an old saying. He was in Kenya on one of these preaching teams, and he was preaching. Something had happened to him back in Gallup. One day he said he looked up and saw the sunset, and God spoke to him and said, someday you're going to see a sunset in another nation. Didn't understand how that was going to work. Filed it away. Now he's preaching with the team, helping out in the conference. He's in his hotel, looks out the window, and sees now an African sunset. And they are intense, very, very wonderful, the African sunsets. And when he looked at the sunset, God spoke to him and reminded him, remember when I told you, you're going to see that overseas someday in another nation. God said, this is where you're supposed to be. This was in Nairobi, Kenya. So he told Pastor Mitchell what God had said to him. Conference of January in 1987, they were launched into Nairobi, Kenya. This is a milestone. Here we got a photo. I want you to see this. In the middle, that is Brian and Mary Yeager. Actually, two church plants to Africa. On the far left, Peter Turco was going to go into Kampala, Uganda. But Brian and Mary Yeager actually arrived and opened first. Nairobi, Kenya was a milestone church. It was the very first church in Africa. They landed in March of 1987, and from the beginning, the response was outstanding in Kenya. We have some old trumpet photos I want to show you. This is the very first trumpet report after they arrived. And in here, if you can see at the top, I know you can't read that whole thing, but we've had over 450 conversions. So numerically, it was just much larger than probably he had ever seen in any of his ministry. Have a next trumpet report here. Here are all different photos, and this is again 1987. Probably, if you can see in the top right-hand corner, there's a crusade that was done 12,500 decisions in one crusade. Just, you're talking off the charts. To our reference points up to that point, that is absolutely incredible. Next photo. Here is God's saving power. Here he's baptizing. There were numbers of baptisms. And in the right, you see some photos of a new convert that God had touched. They eventually, we got a tent, and you'll see in the top right there the statement, the tent was full on opening night. One more picture here. Here's a tent that we actually purchased for them to be able to meet in a Sunday morning service. Here's Pastor Mitchell, and he's praying for someone and giving the report there. A tennis ball sized growth in the abdomen disappeared. Now, the same conference that the Jaegers were sent to Nairobi, Kenya, a man named Peter Turco was sent to Kampala, Uganda. He arrived later in the year, started later in the year. This was our second church in Africa, so very historic. But again, wonderful things happened in response. We have a trumpet report here. And here is him on the streets, just masses of people, outdoor meeting, hundreds of people. And you see the beginnings of the church. That's the original. He probably hadn't been open that long, but immediately a good group of people were there. Then next, as the time went on, here is a crusade. Top left, you see on crutches for 17 years, gloriously healed, tremendous miracles. You see a crowd from the crusade. You're getting an idea. And in there, if I remember right, the report said in this crusade, they had the largest crowd of 10,000, over 10,000 people through the week. They estimated 17,000 decisions. So our first two churches, this is an amazing response. The response level was fantastic. Okay, here's a lesson that why I'm telling you this story. The lesson is that God moves his people through circumstances sometimes. Circumstances are not the only factor in life. Of course, the Word of God, godly counsel, etc., etc. But this is one of the things. What happened was from these churches, reports, whether that was in the trumpet, whether that was telling friends, letters, however the report was getting, there was no internet in those days. But people began to hear about this incredible response. Because God was doing so much, a steady stream of teams of pastors. Often it would be 4 to even up to 6 pastors at a time. They would do a healing crusade. They would do often a local gathering of a conference in this way, trying to impart. They weren't yet at the church planting level. But what happened is now you have, imagine pastors who are having a good response. You have a church of 75, 150, whatever it is, you're making disciples, you're doing work for God. Now you go on a team and you are seeing thousands of people. And you're seeing, how long has this church been open? And there are hundreds of people. So that, what began to happen is that men began to see for themselves, Africa is responsive to the gospel, very responsive. And so what happened is by workers hearing the reports or going themselves, it inspired many of them, which is why God helps with such great response. There were many men who saw, I could make great impact here. If I was in Africa, who knows but what God might use me in that way. It inspired men. The glory of our fellowship in many ways is we are a fellowship of ordinary people. I don't know if you know this, there are not many superstars. And if you are wondering, you are not one of them. I'm just saying, okay? I am not one of them. So you have to imagine now, these are often, they're going to preach for their friend. They know this guy. And it's like, God is using ordinary people. That's actually more inspiring, right? If Michael Jordan goes and scores 50 points, of course, he's Michael Jordan. If I could score 50, that would be very notable because I can't reach the rim. So that would be miraculous even. And the other thing it did, when you are hearing report, just out of curiosity, how many of you would have been in the conference in January of 1987? Were you there? Okay. How many of you gave in that conference? January 1987. Okay. You are getting, this is what happens in people. You're getting massive return on your investment, isn't it? Right? I don't know if any of you have money in the bank at a whopping 0.0000000.2%. If you could get a tremendous return. So now what happens, this was actually powerful in conferences as people are hearing reports. Now when we're going to launch more churches, it turbocharged giving because people are seeing this is another powerful part of our fellowship. Ordinary people, many of you will never go to Africa, but you have a piece of Africa. You have an investment in heaven, as Paul said, multiplying to your account. And so what began to happen was, whenever you see tremendous response, it inspires giving. You don't have to tell teary stories of Maggie's crutch and make people feel guilty. Just tell them, show them what God is doing. You could have a part in that. We have a trumpet report from kind of that area. Here was the front page. You see crowds in Kenya, Uganda, I think Liberia is the third photo. And this is Africa's hour, because that was definitely true. There was something powerful that God was doing in Africa. And so this inspired, the result of people giving and people being inspired from 1987 to 1989. In 3 years, just from Prescott alone, the Prescott Conference alone, we planted 37 international churches. You've got to understand how incredibly powerful that was. 37 in 3 years. 2 conferences a year. We're averaging a little over 6 per conference. International. So people are inspired to go. People are inspired to give. When you're seeing that response, it wasn't just limited to Africa. We were planting churches in Asia, all kinds of places, but response in what God did in Africa was very powerful. And I'm also included. At the same time, God was doing this in some ways in the Philippines, but of course I'm just concentrating on Africa right now. So we started sending churches to other African nations. We sent works to Tanzania, Liberia, Burundi, and Ghana. We have a picture here. This is Carrie Mejia. Carrie and Carmen Mejia went to Ghana, West Africa. I believe they were the first ones to ever go to Ghana. And you're seeing there the people that he is baptizing. So this is what God began to do. Now, I'm going to come back to Kenya in a moment and tell you some very powerful stories. But the man who started the church in Uganda, he was there for a short time and then he was going to go. In 1978, John Overson was in the church in Bullhead City. This is where he got saved. And they showed a very old movie called Some Through the Fire. And this was about the persecution years ago in Uganda. He said, now he's a young man, I'm going back in time now, 1978. Watching that film, God did something in his heart and said, God, I am willing to go overseas. But look at how God arranges this. The film was about Uganda. He told Pastor Mitchell at a meeting we used to have in Phoenix, he said, Pastor Mitchell, I would like, by this time now, we're moving ahead in time into the late 80s, and he told Pastor Mitchell, I would like to go on a mission trip sometime. And Dad said, those three guys over there, they're going, go tell them that you want to go with them. And so he did. Where were they going? Uganda. Where did he see the film and get stirred? Uganda. This is how God works sometimes. And so he joined them. He said he went and preached, helped in the same kind of thing, crusade, conference, preaching, and he is seeing the incredible need, because Africa has great needs, and the great response. His heart, he said, just looking at it, his heart began to beat. He is completely stirred. And he said he was sharing a hotel room with another pastor, and he just couldn't believe what he was feeling. So he said to his fellow pastor brother who was with him on the team, he said, are you feeling anything about this place? And the man looked at him and said, I feel absolutely nothing. Because it is a heart issue. He said after he returned 3 months later, he happened to be with Pastor Mitchell. They were having some kind of meeting in Kingman. And Dad happened to ask him, hey, John, how was Uganda when you went, knowing it was his first time? And he told Pastor Mitchell, he said, if you ever need me to go, I would be willing to go. Dad was wise, he said, because Uganda was very primitive in those days. And so he said, I think your wife should look at it first. And so he took Colleen, and they went and preached, looked at the work in Kampala, and Colleen said, yes, I would be willing to go. And so they did. They went to Kampala, Uganda. They were the second pastors of the church there, and they spent 5 years. We have some photos of the Oversons. Here they are. And this is in that time, I believe that is actually in Kampala. There's the family. That's a young Weston who you would know, their daughter. Next photo is, that's congregation on a Sunday morning, and you're seeing here different shot out on the steps and then doing something outdoors. And so it was just a tremendous response. John said those are some of the best days of his life, just seeing God save people. And again, the response is what really, really was moving. Later on, they wound up leaving, and Jim and Sharon Radersdorf took over that work. They were there for 4 years. They spent 4 years during that time. And then ultimately, when they left, they nationalized the church. And here is one of the original converts. Next photo. Here's more shots of Uganda. And there's some outreaches, revival leadership conference. They weren't fitting, so they did it outdoors. Here, outreach and advertising it. And I believe that is John preaching some form of a crusade there. Next photo. And here, this is Richard and Margaret Tadwa, original converts, discipled in the church. He is now the pastor of the church in Kampala, Uganda, and is the leader of all of our churches in Uganda. Right now, next photo, they are currently building a building. What you see on the bottom is the building. It's not finished, but they are constructing a building after being years in tents. The African sun, African weather doesn't do good things to tents. And so they were there in a tattered old tent, and so now we help them, don't remember, with the land, I think, and maybe we'll be helping some more, but nonetheless, here is the work there. Some of our brothers from Holland are, that is Etienne Desain and Bert Flederis are preaching in that conference. And here on the left, these are delegates going to the Nairobi conference. And so God is doing, last conference, that was just a few months ago, they planted 4 churches. There are now 42 churches in Uganda. And so God was doing good things. Now, let's go back to Kenya. So in the response in Kenya, we started sending more workers. This is what happens. The word is spreading, so God is moving upon other people to go. God was stirring. Vic and Wilma were in Scotland, and he began to tell Pastor Mitchell, I believe that God wants me to make a move and go somewhere else. And so Dad asked him the obvious question, where? And he said, I don't know. And Dad said, so he said, you're supposed to tell me where to go. And Dad said, I don't operate like that, Vic. And so he left it, but he was persistent, still was telling him that he wanted to make a move. And sure enough, later on, he said, I need you in Kisumu, Kenya. It had been pioneered, and so the Easons came and took over the work. We have a photo here. This is an early report, and there is Vic praying for a blind man who got healed. This is an outdoor crusade, and there is another shot of him preaching in the crusade. Did a great work in Kisumu, Kenya. Kisumu, I believe, was the second work we had there in Kenya, and then they moved on and went to Zambia, which I'll tell about later on. Tom Drought, again pastoring, and I believe he was in Farmington or Phoenix. I don't remember, maybe Phoenix by that time. He went in with a team. This is often what would happen. Groups of pastors would go. He was going to help with the team to preach in the conference in Nairobi, and I see in my notes it was Phoenix where he was pastoring. At that time, he said he felt unsettled in his ministry in Phoenix, which is often God stirring the nest to prepare you for something else. He felt stirred and was actually looking at Tanzania, was thinking of going to Tanzania, and one of his friends was in Tanzania. The hunting in Tanzania had no decision, no part of his decision making. He was just drawn for the souls of men. That's for Tom there, my little inside joke. But nonetheless, he was looking at, he actually on the crusade, he asked Dad if he could go and look at Tanzania, which he did, and was originally planning on going there. But he ultimately told Pastor Mitchell, I'm willing to go to Tanzania, but he said, I'm willing to do anything. And so conference was going to be coming up. And so when the Easons moved to Zambia, which I'll tell about later on, Tom and Cindy Drought wound up taking the church in Kisumu, Kenya. I have some photos of during that time. Here is Tom preaching. And bottom left, a baptism in Kisumu. Top right, here's the tent that we would have purchased for the church in Kisumu. There's the congregation. This is in Tom and Cindy Drought's era. Bottom right, there's a photo of the tent from the inside. And so you're seeing great work that God was doing in Kisumu, Kenya. John McCarthy heard Pastor Mitchell preaching in conference, and we had, through circumstances, there was a group of people in Liberia who were meeting together, but they had no pastor. Somehow found out about our fellowship, or someone had contact with the fellowship. So they were asking, would you send someone to Liberia? And so Pastor Mitchell in conference, probably it was Monday night, he was preaching, stirring people to obey the call of God. And he's told about this group of people in Liberia, and he said, that group of people, they need a pastor. Is there someone willing to go? And so John MacArthur wound up going and telling him that he was willing to go. But John and Esther Gooding had actually spoken to Pastor Mitchell, so they were going to go and take the work that had been pioneered in Liberia. Another man had pastored there, complicated situation. But nonetheless, so McCarthy's are now in motion, willing to go, but no, Liberia, we filled that. So he wound up pioneering in Nakuru, Kenya. And we have some photos from their time in Nakuru. This is, the center is the photo of them as they arrived in Nakuru. And then you see some photos of the tent jammed to capacity. And you see different photos of the work that God was doing. They were there for 8.5 years. Some converts that were saved originally in Nakuru. They wound up nationalizing it. Next photo, here is Eric and Clementina Muyea, who you would see they come to conference. They've been here in our church. These are now the pastors of the church in Nakuru and one of the larger church planting churches there. So God's doing good work. The Droughts wound up moving from Kisumu when a worker left Nairobi, and they took over the church in Nairobi. Next photo is here now. This is now in Nairobi, Kenya, in an area called Kibera, that they took over the church and pastored there for a time. Mike and Yolanda Stamper came and took over. They were stirred, and so they took over the church in Kisumu from the Droughts. We have some photos from their time there, and so here is the delegates for conference. There is a picture of the church. This is from their, that's a wedding. And then again, you're seeing the responsiveness of what God was doing. Tom Paine went and preached in Kenya, and God stirred him. Again, I'm telling you, this is often what happens. He's stirred by what he sees. He's stirred by the possibility. So when he got back, he made himself available and said, Pastor Mitchell, if you need me, I'm willing to go to Kenya. And Pastor Mitchell said, not at this moment. So he said, mentally, he just moved on, bought a house in Farmington, making disciples, doing a good work there. Pastor Mitchell called and asked him a question one day, Tom, are you settled where you're at? And Tom said, yes. By that time, bought a house, I'm happy. But he went on another team, and when he went on a team, he was struggling inside, and God told him, I want you to come here. This is in Nairobi. I want you to come to Nairobi. And so when he got back, God prompted him, call Pastor Mitchell, tell him, you're not as settled as you said you were. And so the moment he said that, Dad said, what about Nairobi? We're going to make a change. And sure enough, where God told him he was going to go, that is exactly what he did. Have some photos. The Paines went to Nairobi, and you'll see top right here is Tom preaching outdoors. Bottom, there is the tent filled to absolute capacity, 900 to even up to 1,200 at times. Here's a street outreach, and one of the Paine girls, I think that's Michelle, preaching there. Next photo, you'll see here disciples. Tom is a disciple maker and was majoring in discipleship, training them. Here are disciples doing crusades themselves, which is the work of every missionary, is not building a church. You're there to make disciples. Next photo, here we have all of the Paine girls also got involved. You'll see here is Michelle in the top right, Melissa, there's Janice, they're all on outreach, and there's Jennifer as well. They were all involved in the work of God in Kenya. One of the great things that God did in Tom Paine's ministry was financial breakthroughs. This is very powerful. Any nation that is racked by poverty, it's very common that they get a poverty mentality. How are we going to get by in life? Somebody else is going to hand it to us. And so Tom got financial breakthroughs. He discovered that as he took over now not only the church, he was now the national leader. He discovered they had pastors that were not tithing. There were pastors that didn't personally tithe. There were pastors that their church didn't tithe. And so you're never going, if you're robbing God, you're never going to get ahead. He began to challenge people to take responsibility. He gave, just for reference sake, in August of 1996, when Tom originally went on a team, this is before he took over, on that team, what they would do, each pastor that would come, they would work out what will it cost the crusade and the conference, what will the cost be for the conference, and each pastor, they would divide it up and they would contribute from their church. So Tom said in 1996, their team had to bring $5,000 US, which is of course a much larger amount today with inflation, to help pay for the conference. When he arrived in Kenya, in the February 1997 conference, because Tom has financial dominion and began to preach and challenge, they reduced that. They only needed $800 US. So now he's getting, Kenyans have to invest in Kenya. By February of 1998, they didn't need any money from outside. Not only did they not need money from outside to pay for the conference, on Thursday night, because they weren't at the point of planting churches internationally yet, they took a world evangelism offering and sent it to Prescott. Now, I want to tell you that's the same pattern that we followed in South Africa. When locals believe in the vision enough to invest in it and pay for it themselves, you know that you are winning. And that is a major, major milestone. Now, here's a lesson. I'm going to tell you some fascinating stories. The lesson is about overcoming the gates of hell. Let's read Matthew 16:18.
And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay, gates are where strategies were formed in ancient times. The Bible speaks about this. When they're going to battle, they met at the gate to decide that. So Jesus is saying the strategies of hell will not prevail. The devil will not win if it is a genuine work of God. Okay, here's the story. Tom Paine is there. He's not there long when one of the men who lived on the property, was responsible for numbers of things, was responsible for counting or in some way had access to the offerings. Tom he began to be suspicious and had an allegation. He had no proof yet, but he felt that the man was stealing the money, and so he disciplined him. And what Tom didn't know is that this man immediately went out. Two rebellious men who had left the church, they made a plot to take over the church, to steal the church. So Tom is talking to this man. He said at the time that he's talking to him, he doesn't have all of the information, but if you pray and you ask God for guidance, he said he just felt on the inside, even before he had all the information, he suddenly looked at the man and he said, "Give me your keys." And the man said, "But Pastor, if I give you my keys, I will not have keys." He said, "That's right, give me your keys right now." Got the keys. He got the keys off him. What he didn't know is they had plotted the next Sunday, they were going to lock Tom Paine out and take over the church. So this was God, just an inner prompting. So this delayed this plan. He said the man that he had just disciplined now missed church, and he showed up in the evening service late. And so Tom called him over. He said, "Where were you?" And he said, "I was nowhere, Pastor." I was nowhere. he was at a meeting, again, making plot. Okay, we're going to do it this weekend, didn't work out. Now, how are we going to take over the church and steal it? So Tom didn't have all of the information. That man went off the platform. A pastor who Tom had actually not really ever spoken to came and said, I have to speak to you. I want to confess something. He said, I just left a meeting. They are plotting. They're going to try to steal the church. And that man is involved in it. So he called him up, had the man tell what he said. And so he fired him, removed him, and they got him a house kind of far enough away to be safe, paid his rent for 6 months, but they got him away. He said that that man came in the following Sunday, that he now didn't have keys, but he came in and made a scene and violently was trying to make a scene to try to take over the church. It was so bad they had to call the police. This made the papers. It was problematic. Tom now is very, very troubled. He called Pastor Mitchell, and so Pastor Mitchell flew Harry Hills, who was the previous pastor of the church and was well-liked, flew him in. He's going to do a revival. Harry came and preached one service, got scared, and said, I'm leaving, jumped on a plane and left. Thank you, Harry. But so Tom is now he's only been there a short time. He doesn't know what's going on. He had met a man named David Hadley. David and Jennifer Hadley were missionaries from another fellowship. Tom doesn't know who to talk to. He asked this man, can you meet me? And he said, what do I do? This is what's going on. The man said, you better go to the registration office and make sure that they have not removed you from the corporation. So he goes to this office. He said it's 2 stories high with cardboard boxes of files. Like, where would your file even be? Asked the man, who he was and the organization. The man said, oh yeah, I just saw your file. It's on the desk. Why? Because they were plotting. What they do is they bribe someone to make a fake document, put it in the file, and then they call the police and they say, we're the owners, you're out. And that's very, very common. So he said, you better make sure. So this man said, no, I will help you. I will help you. So Tom doesn't know there are shifty people in the world. The next day, he got a call from a man named Paul Limonaggi, who said, I am from the president's office. I need to meet with you. I need to ask you some questions. What do you want to ask? He wouldn't tell him. So Tom was very wary, met him at a coffee shop away from his house. He wanted to come to his house, and he said no. He wouldn't tell him where he lived because he didn't know who this man was. And so he meets him, and the man is asking questions, wanted a document, made him give a document. He got a call from John McCarthy. John McCarthy said, I'm barricaded in the house. 2 Mercedes showed up, and they want to take me away for questioning. Tom, what's going on? And Tom was in Nakuru. So Tom has no idea. He said, I don't know. Hang up, and I'll call the embassy. He called the embassy. They said, we can't do anything unless they take him. And when he called back, they had taken John away. No cell phones in those days. So Tom is freaking out. What are they going to do? The next day, 2 Mercedes show up full of men. One of these is Paul Limonaggi, who says he's from the office of the president. He actually was special branch, CID, attached to the president. This would be kind of a combination between Secret Service and the FBI. But he is the president's representative, wants to talk to Tom Paine. He's standing out in front of his gate. I want to come in. We want to talk to you. And Tom says, you're not coming in. And he said, if you don't come in, then we're taking you away. Tom didn't want them to take him away. And he said, come in. But Tom he said his mother was visiting his 75-year-old mother was visiting from America. It's 2 weeks before Christmas. So he played the outrage. He said, I can't believe it. You won't even tell. You're treating me like a criminal. My mother's here for Christmas. And so the man was polite and said, okay, we won't talk in the house. They're sitting in the garage for 2 hours. He's grilling him. Why are you here? Are you involved in politics? No, I'm not involved. Are you a racist? And he's like, why are you asking me this? And so then he finally said, do you have anything with Wayman Mitchell's signature on it? And he's like, I don't. He said, go get it right now. He goes in the house, is like, they are freaking out. Janice, what do we, they couldn't find any letters. What do we have with Pastor Mitchell's signature? Janice said, our marriage certificate. Got the marriage certificate, and the man took that away. Like, why do you, would not explain what he wanted. The next morning, he gets a call from Mike Stamper in Kisumu, and he said, Tom, I know what this is about. He said, I was just at a meeting of local pastors, and they said they passed out a letter that's supposed to be from Pastor Mitchell. This is what the letter said. Dear Tom, I'm sending Harry Hills with $5 million for you to distribute to turn the upcoming election to get rid of that monkey, the president, Daniel Arap Moi. Signed, Wayman Mitchell. Do you understand this is not good? So he is absolutely freaking out. You have to go get that letter. He had actually just put it in the mail, but he said, I don't care what you have to do. You have to get that letter. Got it, faxed it to Paul Limonagi from the president's office, and he said, he called and explained. He said, come see me tomorrow. When he went to meet with him, Tom explained what was going on, the uprising, they're trying to get the church, all of these things, the office there where our file was, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he said, let me look into this. A few days later, he contacted Tom and he said, we have investigated and we realize you were being slandered. This was not true. You're not going to be bothered again. And what swayed them was when they gave the marriage certificate, they realized the letter that was signed, and Tom said, whoever forged it, it was very good, but it was signed Wayman Mitchell. And my father never signs his name Wayman Mitchell. His middle name was Othel. He always signed Wayman O. Mitchell. For an O, the work of God in Kenya was preserved. Because that is God at work. Amen. So he told Tom Payne, he said, if you ever need anything, let me know. The man who tried to steal the church then came demanding money, and when Tom said, no, we're not giving you money, then he made a threat on his life, and so he called Mr. Limonagi. You said, if I ever need anything, he said, this man is demanding money and making a threat of violence. And so a little while later, he called and he said, I don't think you'll ever be hearing from that man again. Tom said, is he okay? And the man laughed. He said, he's okay, but he won't be bothering you again. Tom each year would take Paul Limonagi a gift, or would send a gift, a pen set. I'm not talking about a bribe, but just a gift from America. One year, he sent Wycliffe to give a gift and found out Paul Limonagi was in the hospital. He was dying. And so Tom told Wycliffe, go right now. Kenyans don't like hospitals. He said, you go to the hospital, use my name, tell them that you want to see and you want to pray for Paul Limonagi. When he got there, he laid hands and God did a miracle and healed this man. Gave him some more time. Out of that, he invited them to come over for lunch. And while they're at this powerful man's house, Tom witnesses to him, prayed the sinner's prayer. Later on, he came to a crusade and met my father in Nairobi. And then ultimately, later on, he wound up passing away. The church in Nairobi, they built a building. And Tom Payne and I, we have a theory this should be punishment for errant pastors. You should have to build a building in Africa. That's a different thing, but nonetheless, Tom is still saved. After this next photo, As part of the building here, they built the Wayman O. Mitchell Fellowship Library and Reading Room. There's my father next to his, the library in his name. Next photo, here are the disciples reading in the Wayman Mitchell Fellowship Library. Later on, when the Paynes left, they nationalized the church and they turned it over to Patrick and Carolyn Nehemiah. We have a video I want to show you. This is of conference. I can't remember this year or last year. They're going to show a video as soon as they have that ready. Okay, praise God. If you invested in Kenya, you have a part of that. And the next photo, out of that conference, next photo, that conference, there were 8 couples that were launched, and that was their largest ever. We now have 50 churches in Kenya, plus they have another 3 churches in 2 other nations, in Tanzania and Rwanda. And the next photo that we have here is, there's the building that was built under the Paynes watch. And Patrick and Carolyn Nehemiah, they were saved, discipled, and now are the pastors of the church in Nairobi and the leaders in Kenya. Final, there's a side note. As you know, Russia, because of the war, American Westerners cannot get into Russia. They have 2 conferences a year. No Westerners can get in. And so in the last conference, just in August, I think, Patrick Nehemiah and George Mbugua from Kenya, they were the main speakers. Got some photos here. They're arriving in Russia. There's Patrick preaching. And our investment is not only reaching in Africa, but touching the world. Isn't that wonderful in what God is doing? Thank God. Final, I want to show you a photo from my dad's Bible. This is a word that he was given in conference July of 1989. Be strong and of good courage and do it. Fear not, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God, even my God, will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you until you have finished all the work for the service of the house of God. And you'll see he wrote in the left, what God was impressing him is Indonesia, Africa, Spain, and the United States. I am telling you, what we're doing is a work of God. It's a miracle. It's a miracle in how it comes about. It's a miracle in how it's preserved. It's a miracle in the work that continues to multiply even to this day. Thank God. That's all we have. Morning service will be here in a bit. Thank God.